I've lived in a lot of places, but never in my life did I expect something like this when we moved in. We've been here for almost 2 months now. It's a beautiful place, 5 acres, a lovely home, plenty of space for my kids to grow up. It seemed perfect at first. Then I met the neighbor across the road. He's 82, but honestly, you wouldn't guess it. He looks and acts like he's in his 60s. At first, I thought he was just another friendly neighbor. Turns out, his whole family surrounds us. His daughter lives on one side, his nephew on the other, his sister and brother each a couple of houses down. I figured it's not unusual in a small town, but still, something about it made me uneasy. And then, he started talking. He told us we had to mow our yard every 5 days. Now, keep in mind, we're out in the country. There's no HOA here, and our yard is more of a hayfield that we're baling. But it didn't stop there. He also said I shouldn't talk to him directly. If we needed something, I had to go through my husband or his wife. And to top it off, he told me I should grow my hair out so I'd look more motherly. I smiled and nodded, trying to brush it off. Maybe it's just his age, right? A few days later, there was a knock at the door. A man introduced himself as the neighbor from diagonally across the street. He handed me a Bible and, with the creepiest grin, said, "Everyone around here goes to this church." He kept smiling as he turned to leave, saying over his shoulder, "See you there on Sunday." I didn't even get a chance to reply. Then came Saturday. My husband was outside working, and I was inside with the kids when another car pulled up. This time, it was the first neighbor's wife. And when I say she walked into my house, I mean she didn't knock. She just let herself in, like it was hers. She took one look at the Halloween decorations we had up and gasped, like she'd seen something truly offensive. She didn't even introduce herself, just asked to speak to the woman of the house privately, outside. I was already annoyed, so I snapped, "Yeah, outside sounds great." Once we were outside, she went on a list of demands like she owned me or something. We needed to mow the yard more often. Her husband was going to tell mine that I had been walking out to get the mail by myself. The skeleton decorations? Apparently, they were vulgar. And the most disturbing part? She said she was going to babysit my infant son twice a week because, and I swear these were her exact words, he's the first fresh blood in the area in a long time. At that point, I was done. Mama Bear mode kicked in. I stood up, looked her dead in the eye, and told her to leave. She barely even reacted, just told me I needed to be more ladylike. That's when I said, "Leave or I'm calling the cops." She huffed and left, but that wasn't the end of it. Since then, either she or her husband have parked on the road, just sitting there, staring at our house. The guy who gave me the Bible, he's been leaving handwritten notes in our mailbox every single week. They all say the same thing. "We missed you at church this Sunday. You need to be there next week." I went to the local police, but they were no help. It's like no one here thinks this is weird, like this behavior is totally normal. But I can feel it. Something's wrong here. It feels like we've stumbled into a nightmare, and I have no idea how to get out. How can I even begin to tell you this story? It was, without a doubt, the most disturbing thing that's ever happened to me. This was about a month ago. I'm 15, and it was a regular night for me. I'd been playing video games and was just about to call it a night when I heard the doorbell ring. It was strange because it was around 11 p.m. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone messing around, but I got up anyway and started heading downstairs. Halfway down, something clicked in my mind. Who rings a doorbell this late? I stopped dead in my tracks, feeling uneasy. Then the doorbell rang again, twice this time. My parents came out of their room, just as confused as I was. We all exchanged looks, and nobody had any idea what was going on. Then we heard someone pounding on the door. My mom flinched. My dad, trying to keep it together, decided to go check who it was. He slowly opened the door, just enough to peek through, and saw it was our neighbor. My dad opened the door a bit wider, and that's when things took a turn. The neighbor started shouting at my dad, accusing us of stealing his house. He was angry. His words didn't make sense, and you could just tell something was really off. My dad, clearly caught off guard, tried to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. Eventually, my dad just closed the door, but that didn't stop him. The neighbor started throwing himself against the door. It was loud and the whole house shook. My dad rushed back to brace the door, while my mom ran to get my younger siblings. I grabbed my phone and immediately called 911. For what felt like forever, the pounding on the door kept going. I was on the phone with 911, telling them what was happening, praying they'd get here fast. Suddenly, everything went quiet. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. I looked out the window, and that's when I saw him get into his Jeep. He sat there for a moment, and then I heard the engine start. At first, I didn't know what he was doing, but then I saw him hit the gas and drive straight toward our house. He slammed on the brakes at the last second, right before crashing into the door. He was trying to scare us. I backed away from the window, trying to stay calm for my siblings, but inside, I was terrified. I had no idea what he was going to do next. I stayed on the phone with 911, hoping the police would arrive before things got any worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the police showed up and arrested him. They dragged him away, but the whole situation left me shaken. Even after he was gone, I couldn't get the image of him ramming his car at our house out of my head. The next morning, I stepped outside, and there were tire marks right up to our front steps. It was a chilling reminder of what could have happened if he hadn't stopped. But the scariest part, he's still living next door. Every time I step outside, I know he's just there, watching, and that thought never leaves me. There are some things you just can't forget, no matter how hard you try. What happened to me that year still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It all started when I moved into my first apartment alone. I was excited, you know. Finally, my own space, no one to answer to, no noise from roommates. The building itself was nothing special, old, a little run down, but it was cheap and quiet, perfect for someone like me who didn't need much. For the first few weeks, everything was fine, normal even. I'd go to work, come home, hit the gym, and binge some TV. I didn't really interact with my neighbors, just nodded when we passed each other in the hall. It was a quiet building, and I liked it that way. Then, one night, something changed. I got home late after a shift, and noticed a light on in the apartment next to mine. The strange part? That apartment had been vacant since I moved in. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe they'd rented it out without me noticing. But it wasn't just the light that was off. It was the feeling I got, like the air in the hall had shifted, heavier, almost suffocating. I shrugged it off though, went inside, locked my door, and tried to forget about it. But later that night, something woke me up. A faint sound, almost like someone whispering on the other side of the wall. At first, I thought it was my imagination, But it kept happening night after night. I started staying up later, listening. It wasn't just whispers anymore. I'd hear footsteps, pacing back and forth. The odd part, it would stop whenever I got close to the wall, like whoever was on the other side knew I was listening. The weirdest thing was that I never saw anyone come or go from that apartment. No movers, no new tenant, nothing. One night, I decided to investigate. It was around 2 a.m. and the whispers had started again, louder this time, like whoever or whatever it was wanted me to hear. I stepped out into the hallway, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing, just the empty, dimly lit corridor. I approached the door of the apartment next to mine, and that's when I noticed it. The door was slightly ajar. I should have turned back, gone inside, and locked my door, but I didn't. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The place was dark, empty, completely bare, like no one had ever lived there, except for one thing, a single chair in the middle of the living room, facing the wall. That's when I felt it, the undeniable sense that someone was watching me. My heart pounded as I backed out of the apartment and rushed back to mine, locking every bolt behind me. But the moment I closed my door, there was a knock. Not a loud bang, just a soft, deliberate knock. I froze, listening. Then it came again, soft but insistent. Against every instinct, I looked through the peephole. No one. The hall was empty, but I could still feel it. That presence. It was still there. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers, the knocking, it all kept going, but only when I was alone in the dark. And then, things started escalating. Items in my apartment began to disappear. Small things at first, my keys, a remote, a single shoe. Then, they'd reappear in the strangest places. My keys were once found in the freezer, the remote, in my bathroom sink. I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted the landlord, asked him about the apartment next door. His response still gives me chills. He looked confused, almost concerned, and said, "No one's lived in that unit for over 5 years. It's been vacant since the last tenant. Well, since he disappeared." Disappeared. I wanted to press him for details, but the look on his face told me he wasn't going to say anything more. That night, I decided to leave. I packed a bag and planned to crash at a friend's place. But as I was leaving, I heard the whisper again. Only this time, it was coming from inside my own apartment. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned to face the dark hallway leading to my bedroom, and there, in the shadow, I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the light, motionless. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted out of there and never looked back. To this day, I still don't know who or what was in that apartment, or why it started coming for me. All I know is I was lucky to get out when I did, because sometimes, even when you think you're alone, you're not. I don't even know where to begin. This is one of the most disturbing experiences of my life, and to this day, it still haunts me. It all started like any other day. My girlfriend and I had just moved into a quiet neighborhood, thinking we'd found the perfect place to settle. Our neighbors seemed friendly enough at first, a bit too polished, like a cookie-cutter suburban family. The mother and I would chat occasionally over gardening tips, and while her laugh had this strange, almost forced quality to it, I didn't think much of it. But that's where the normalcy ended. One day, they must have seen my girlfriend and I kissing through our kitchen window. I guess they assumed we were just roommates up until then, But after that moment, everything changed. Barely 5 minutes later, there was a pounding on our door. The husband, this huge hulking guy with a balding head and these unnerving eyebrows that twitched every time he spoke, was standing there, red-faced and shaking. My girlfriend once joked he looked like a villain straight out of a movie, but there was nothing funny about him now. He screamed at us, his voice echoing down the street. It was the usual rhetoric: religious insults, hellfire threats, accusations of corrupting his children, who, by the way, were grown men. We were speechless, shocked that someone we barely knew could spew such hatred over something as simple as love. My girlfriend managed to calm him down and get him to leave, but the silence that followed us to bed that night was suffocating. Neither of us dared to speak, afraid that acknowledging it would make the nightmare real. That was just the beginning. A few days later, I went out to tend to my garden, only to find it destroyed. Flowers I'd carefully nurtured were snapped in half, their roots ripped from the earth. My vegetables trampled beyond recognition. It was a senseless act of malice. I remember standing there, staring at the devastation, feeling utterly helpless. Then, the real terror began. As if that wasn't enough, our car was vandalized. Slurs were scratched into the paint, deep angry lines covering the entire side of the vehicle. Our tires were slashed, and the headlights shattered. It was like they wanted to dismantle everything we had, piece by piece. I didn't know what to do. We called the police, but there was never enough evidence. The officers looked at us with empty expressions, offering nothing but hollow reassurances. We knew we were on our own. Things escalated quickly. One night, their eldest son stood outside our door at 4 a.m., ringing the doorbell non-stop for what felt like forever. When my girlfriend threatened to call the police, he smirked and urinated on our porch furniture before finally leaving. It only got worse. Every morning, their youngest son followed me during my daily walks with our dog, shouting horrific slurs and threats. He would say things so vile, I could hardly believe it was coming from a human being. I started dreading those walks, but our dog needed the exercise. Eventually, one of our other neighbors, a kind, gym-obsessed guy in his 20s, began walking with me to keep the peace. But even with his presence, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. We began finding disturbing things left on our property. Notes, threats, and one day, rat poison in our dog's water bowl. I don't know why, but we convinced ourselves it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was just paranoia, we told each other, but deep down, we knew better. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every noise, every shadow felt like an impending attack. The final straw was another threat. This time, a note taped to our front door, saying they'd burn the house down with us in it. That night, neither of us could sleep. We sat in silence, clutching each other, praying we'd make it through until morning. I called my brother in desperation, barely able to speak through my sobs. He drove over the next day to help us pack, his face hard and filled with anger. Before we left, he stormed over to the neighbors and let them have it, but I knew nothing he said would make a difference. These people weren't normal. They were monsters, hiding behind their perfect family facade. We moved out that day, leaving behind a place that had become nothing short of a waking nightmare. Even now, I still look over my shoulder, wondering if they're watching, waiting for the next opportunity to destroy someone else's life. The scars they left, both on our home and on our souls, will never fully heal. I'm 22 years old now, and I still grapple with the shadows of my childhood. It all began with a neighbor, a man in his 60s or 70s who passed away a few years ago. But even in death, the memories of his torment linger, as if they were etched into the very walls of our home. When he was alive, he turned our lives into a waking nightmare. He seemed to take pleasure in causing chaos, scratching the paint on our car, poisoning our apple trees, and even exploding fireworks near me when I was just 4 years old, leaving me with a temporary deafness in one ear. To make matters worse, his son was a judge in our city. Whenever we tried to take action against him, it felt like we were fighting a losing battle. My dad often called home from work, reminding us to stay with Grandma, always worried for our safety. As a child, I had recurring nightmares of a face hovering outside the bathroom window. That window was perched high above the bathtub, so high that no one could see in unless they climbed onto the roof of our shed, conveniently located right beneath it. And that shed stood directly next to the fence, separating our yard from his. I can still remember those nightmares, vivid and unsettling, appearing almost every other night. I never talked about them with my parents. We weren't the type to share our fears, so I buried those feelings deep down, hoping they would fade. Time went on, and I convinced myself those dreams were just figments of a child's imagination. But last year, during a session with my therapist, I brought up those nightmares while discussing some personal issues. After I got home, my mom asked what we talked about, and I finally opened up about those dreams. Her response sent a shiver through me. She reminded me that I once told her I saw our neighbor on the roof of the shed. I had no memory of saying that, but she insisted I had mentioned it several times. Even friends who visited our house claimed they saw him up there, peering into our yard, and it scared them. But what really unsettled me was that I had never shared about him watching me shower until my mom brought it up. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Those nightmares weren't just dreams. They felt too real to ignore. The thought that he could have been lurking there, hidden in the shadows, still weighs heavily on me. Another incident that haunts me happened when I was around 9 or 10. One evening, I went to the balcony, which was attached to my room. I often called for my cat from there, but this time, I spotted a figure standing in the middle of our garden. The darkness wrapped around everything, and I couldn't make out who it was at first. I waited, expecting the figure to move, but it just stood there, eerily still, as if frozen in place. I called out, "Dad," hoping it was him, but something felt off. The figure looked up at me, and despite the shadows, I could tell it wasn't my father. My heart raced as I dashed downstairs to get my dad, but when he looked, the figure had vanished. When I went back to the balcony, I caught a glimpse of my neighbor's back door closing, just as I looked over. I can't remember if it was the very next day or a few days later, but suddenly our grass turned a sickly brown. When we investigated, we discovered it had been poisoned. Most of the damage was on the side of the yard farthest from his property line. The realization that he might have done that left me reeling. The combination of fear and disbelief settled into a heavy dread. Even now, the memories cling to me like a bad dream I can't shake off. I still wonder how many more secrets were hidden behind the facade of normalcy in our neighborhood, and if I'll ever truly feel safe again. So, back in 2018, I moved into this cozy little 2-story house in England with my boyfriend at the time. It was in a quiet cul-de-sac with houses all crammed together, facing each other. Now, I'm not really the social type. I prefer my own company and don't usually engage much with neighbors. Still, we had a few casual run-ins and exchanged pleasantries. One of our neighbors, Greg, was super friendly from the start. He was this older guy who would stop for a chat that could go on forever until you had to make up an excuse to escape. He loved sharing local stories and even remembered our birthdays. He invited us to a garden party, saying everyone was welcome. His house was right across from mine, so we could see each other's windows clearly. Time passed, and my boyfriend and I eventually split up. I didn't tell anyone, but I guess word got out since his car was gone. He moved out and left the country, but we still kept in touch as friends. Living alone was tough, so I got a cat to keep me company. He quickly became my whole world. Greg would still flag me down for chats whenever I left or returned home. Annoying, but I managed. I'd tell my ex about these odd little interactions with Greg, and we'd have a laugh. One time, Greg came over to drop off 2 packages for me, one being a big table he hadn't retrieved from his house. I was deep into a game of Elder Scrolls Online, trying to achieve a deathless speed run, so I told him to just leave the packages by the door while I continued playing. I heard the front door open and the sound of the package being set down, but then I felt footsteps behind me. I turned around to find Greg standing there, eyes glued to me. I didn't want to disappoint my gaming group, so I kept playing until we finished the boss fight. When I finally took off my headset, Greg's face lit up. He told me how amazing it was to watch me play and begged me to teach him. I could tell he was drunk, so I laughed it off and tried to brush him off. He seemed disappointed when I opened the door to signal it was time for him to leave, but he eventually did. In the UK, we have individual outdoor bins for trash that we need to roll out to the street the night before collection. You're expected to bring them back in after. I noticed someone was putting my bins back in for me, and I wondered if I was blocking someone's car. Around that time, I also realized someone had been using my bins. When I mentioned this to Greg, he said the same thing had happened to him. It was a bit petty, but I decided to tape an old phone with a surveillance app to my window overlooking the bins to find out who it was. And guess what? It was Greg. I figured he was just running out of bin space since the council had switched from weekly to bi-weekly collections. It bothered me, but I didn't want to confront him about it. Then Christmas came around and the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. One night, I heard a knock at my door. I had no peephole, so I opened the door without knowing what to expect. There stood Greg, and I could immediately smell alcohol. He told me he had a Christmas present for me and handed me a red gift bag with colorful tissue paper. He said, "I really want to give you a kiss on the cheek, but I can't. Not with this pandemic going on." That made my skin crawl, so I tried to wrap up the interaction and get back inside, but he kept rambling on about random things. When he laid a hand on my shoulder, leaned in, and kissed my cheek, I just stood there in shock as he walked away. The gift was strange. Under the tissue paper were 2 bottles of Belgian beer, a half-eaten can of Pringles, and a small bag of chocolates. I recognized the chocolates from a neighbor with kids who had handed those out a few weeks earlier. It was sweet of them, but seeing it re-gifted felt off, especially since Greg didn't even remove the note from the neighbor. That kiss and gift left a bad taste in my mouth, and I decided I wouldn't be polite anymore. I had to be firm next time. On the second day of the new year, feeling a bit lazy, I ordered some food delivery. Just 5 minutes after I got my order, I heard a knock at the door. I knew it had to be Greg. It clicked for me that he often showed up right after anything was delivered. It felt like he was watching my house. He called out for me, but I didn't want to engage, so I went upstairs to avoid him. Later that night, he came back knocking again, but I ignored him, hoping he'd just go away. The next day, I called the police to file a harassment report. I felt a bit silly doing it. Was it really that bad? He was just a lonely old man, and maybe I hadn't been clear enough. They asked if I wanted them to talk to him, but I said I'd handle it myself. I just wanted the report on file in case things escalated. I later felt grateful for doing that. A few days later, Greg showed up at my door, looking worried about me. I told him, I think it's best if we don't have any contact going forward. His response was unsettling. I just wanted to be your friend. I stood my ground, cut the conversation short, and shut the door. I thought that would be the end of it. For a whole year, there were no incidents. It felt peaceful. No knocks on the door or unwanted chats. Then one winter night, I was heading out to get groceries. It was pitch dark outside except for a lamppost, barely illuminating the street. My driveway was at the side of my house, next to the bins, blocked off by a tall fence for privacy, since my kitchen window was right next to it. As I locked my door, I noticed a figure slipping out from my driveway and behind the fence. I quickly unlocked the door and went back inside, my gut telling me something wasn't right. Was someone lurking behind that fence? I decided to skip the groceries for that night and installed a motion sensor light for extra security. A couple of months later, while I was in the kitchen preparing food for my cat, I noticed my motion sensor light turned on. I glanced outside but didn't see anything until I caught sight of something in the corner of the window. It wasn't well lit, and I squinted to make it out. Then suddenly, Greg popped into view, crouched down and peering in through my window. I'm usually pretty calm, but at that moment, I completely lost it. I screamed, "What are you doing?" He just stood there, then casually asked, "Are you all right?" I kept yelling, now asking, "Why are you there?" And he walked off into the dark. I called the police immediately. Normally, the police here aren't the best, but I was impressed with how they handled it. They took my statement over the phone and gave me a reference number. They kept me updated and told me they'd bring him in. It turned out he was already known to the police for following young women. They arrested him at his house in front of a wife I didn't even know he had. They did this to scare him and make a point. Unfortunately, all he received was a police caution that forbade him from being on my side of the cul-de-sac or contacting me. But thankfully, it seemed to work. That incident was the last real interaction I had with Greg. I did catch him staring at me one time while I was in the shower and had forgotten to close the blinds, but nothing else happened after that. Eventually, I moved far away and I couldn't be happier.